Okay, we're going to start this week talking about the classification of living things, meaning how we put the vast array of animals and plants into a specific method of keeping track of them and showing the relationships between various living things. And so the basis for modern classification is a process known as taxonomy. The process is a way of arranging organisms into related groups, and we will talk at length about how these relationships are established. So one way that these relationships can be established is by similarities between various organisms and various types of organisms, and we'll again talk about that in more detail in these slides. So there's a system that's set up that's based on similarity characteristics of body structure, and as I'll state in the future, they also look at molecular characteristics that are similar. A species, this is actually a situation where the definition of species has been bannered about in many different ways. And I'm just going to give you the definition that was in the book, but I can tell you that there's quite a bit of controversy about how to define a species. So a species is a group of individuals derived from similar, and similar means similar characteristics in terms of body structure, parents, and the offspring of those parents can also produce offspring, and that's important in the definition of a species. Now your book goes into, before we talk about kingdoms, your book goes into a big discussion about the difference between species and kinds. And I just don't personally think that that's super important for our study of biology. However, if you get into discussions with scientific individuals around and the biblical ideas around kinds, you might want to take a look at that material. You won't be responsible for knowing the difference between kinds and species for the purposes of quizzes or tests, but it is something that people discuss in biology and in evolution. So the modern classification, the various groups are divided up, and basically when you do these kind of classifications, you're taking a large population and you're dividing it up. Then you'll take the subpopulations and divide those up. And so you start with kingdoms, and those are the largest divisions. So you take, say, plants and animals, and you divide it into plants on one side and animals on another. And then the next division is something called phyla, which we will discuss in more detail in the future. Classes, orders, families, genera, and then species. Now, in each of these, what you're doing is you're taking a larger group and dividing it into smaller groups based on more and more specific similarities. So you're starting with an aerial view, and you're becoming more and more granular as you reduce the size of the groups, and you divide up and divide and divide and divide until you end up with the specific individual in front of you. And as I said, there's a large discussion around the difference between species and kinds that I'm not going to emphasize in this conversation. So this is a good example. You start out with kingdom, plant versus animal, and all the plants are included in this kingdom. Then you take a smaller subset of this larger group and you call it a phylum. And then this one is called Anthrophyta. Anthrophyta only includes these plants and does not include these plants. And we will talk about these plants. We haven't talked about these plants yet. We will talk about these plants and how they are meaningfully different than these plants. Okay? And then you take the phylum and you divide that into a smaller group dicotyledonei, and you might recognize dicot in there. That means their seed has 2 leaves. So all the ones in this class have seeds with 2 leaves. And then the order is yet a smaller group called Rosales. The family is a smaller group called Rosacea. The genus is yet a smaller group, which includes all different kinds of strawberries, and then the species is a specific kind of strawberry. And so this is how classification works. It works from a large group, and you continually divide that group down until you end up with a specific plant. Now, the scientific name that you'll see, and you've probably seen this in some writing and also probably seen this on television from time to time, is called binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature is the 2-word scientific official name for any particular plant or animal. The first part of the name is the genus, and the second part of the name is the species. So the genus species separation, and the genus is always capitalized and the species is always small letter. So humans are Homo, which is genus, sapien, which is species. In wolves, you have Canis, which is all the dog species or genus, Rufus for red, Lupus for gray, and Latrans for the coyote, which is a type of wolf that's different from the other 2. Modern taxonomy also divides not just plants and animals, but eukaryotes from prokaryotes in the single-cell organisms. And so eukaryotes are organisms, and we've talked about eukaryotes versus prokaryotes before, but just as a reminder, eukaryotes have membrane-bound nuclei and membrane-enclosed organelles, whereas prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound nuclei and do not have membrane-enclosed organelles. So here's a slide that shows the difference between the eukaryote and the prokaryote. Now both have a cell membrane, as you can see here, but these, like the chloroplast here, the mitochondria here, the various other organelles all have membranes and have an organization. You notice the ribosomes, for example, are attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and then you have a membrane-bound nucleus with an internal nucleolus. This is a eukaryotic cell. Prokaryotic cells do not have membrane-bound nucleus, but an organization of DNA that's called a nucleoid, and then a little side amount of DNA called a plasmid. They have scattered ribosomes throughout their cytoplasm, and so their organelles are much less well organized than the eukaryotic cells. So here's another table that looks at the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. In terms of DNA, as I said, the DNA is naked. It's also circular and has no introns. You probably don't remember that introns were something that we talked about a long time ago, which I'm not going to review today, but the eukaryotic cells have introns in their DNA. The DNA is linear, and it's bound by a protein membrane, which is in the nucleus. The organelles, again, there's no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, and they have ribosomes, which are called 70S ribosomes. That's related to the size of the ribosome. This is as opposed to eukaryotes that have a nucleus bound by a membrane, and then 80S ribosomes. Prokaryotes reproduce by binary fission. Eukaryotes by mitosis and meiosis. We've discussed this in the past. And generally, prokaryotes are smaller, eukaryotes are larger cells. So we discussed that in kingdoms, there's actually 5 kingdoms discussed in your book. One kingdom is plantae, which includes all green plants, multicellular eukaryotes that carry on photosynthesis. Fungi, which are all the fungus, multicellular with a cell wall, but do not do photosynthesis, and we will talk next week about how they get their energy. Animalia, which is all the animal species, multicellular animal species, and eukaryotic cells that do not have a cell wall. Remember, cell walls are a characteristic of plants and not animals. Protista, which are eukaryotes that are not plants, fungi, or multicellular animals. And then Eubacteriaceae, which are true bacteria, and Archaebacteriaceae that are prokaryotes without a peptidoglycan in their cell wall. So Archaeobacteria is, the word archaea means old, and they're thought to be before the true bacteria, and so that's how they get that name, and they're more primitive than the true bacteria. There are domains in taxonomy. One domain includes all eukaryotes and is called Eukarya. Bacteria is all of the bacteria in the kingdom of bacteria. Archaea, which is the kingdom of Archaeobacteria. Now let's talk for a minute about the way that evolutionary thought has impacted taxonomy. The evolutionary misconceptions that have influenced taxonomy include the idea of phylogeny. Phylogeny is an important idea because basically phylogeny is the study of, quote, evolutionary relationships between organisms. And so what it tries to do is look at the relation that two organisms and their similarity and try to show that this similarity is due to an evolutionary process from a simple form to a more complex form, and that process is known as phylogeny. Cladistics is the assumption that commonalities between organisms reflect evolutionary relationships between those organisms. So, for example, the fact that monkeys sort of look like us and are bipedal and sort of have various commonalities with humans leads people to believe that there's an assumption that there's an evolutionary relationship between monkeys and humans. And that leads to what's known as the phylogenetic tree, which is a tree of organisms where all the forms are traced back until you get to a single trunk. And then, as it develops in an evolutionary way, and I know we didn't talk about evolution this year, but as it develops in an evolutionary way, you can see there's branching off of various forms, but you can always see similarities that bring you back to the original form. And then lastly, there's a more modern use when you see molecular similarities between organisms, that they use that to suggest relationship instead of physical characteristics. One example of this is comparing the DNA similarities, say, between monkeys and humans. When you do that, you see that there's about 94% of the DNA is almost identical. And so they use that similarity to say that the monkeys and humans evolved from each other. Now, this statement I've got at the bottom, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, was a scientific statement that used to be made for quite a long time. And what it essentially, ontogeny is the embryological development of an organism, and phylogeny is the evolutionary relationships. And what they tried to do is look at the embryological similarities between various species and show that meant that there was an evolutionary relationship.